the link to which you can get at the top of the chat. It's currently pinned there, where you can get a free PDF of this book. And today we're going to be starting at the beginning of chapter 9, which is page 176 of the PDF, or 174 on the actual page number on the bottom left of the page here. So let's get into it. Chapter 9, Consensus in Wider Society. The rest of this book comes from our own experiences of facilitating consensus in groups of between 2 people and several thousand. Equality, freedom, shared responsibility, respect. By using consensus in our groups, we learn to make these abstract principles a bit more real in our day-to-day decision-making. We can carve out a little space in which we experience both the challenges and the fulfillment of empowerment and cooperation. However, the scope of our decision-making is limited. These groups are relatively small and self-selected, making decisions on just a small range of specific questions. In other areas of our life, we simply have to befit ourselves as best we can around the rules of the powers that be. We have little or no control in important decisions, like whether our tax money should fund wars, whether the local accident and emergency hospital department should stay open, or how public education should work. This chapter looks at how the principles of consensus might be applied in the whole of society, so we can all have true involvement in these fundamental decisions. If in your head you are now trying to marry up the process you use to make decisions in your small group with the institutions that run the world today, the mismatch will be pretty mind-boggling. Clearly, we cannot replace the United Nations by getting everyone in the world to sit in a huge circle and do a 9 billion person go-round on every issue that comes up. But it would be funny. Nor would it greatly help if we were to change national parliaments so that they used consensus with each other to make laws. Their interests would still be very remote from the people they were supposed to represent. This chapter, therefore, is less about how to run our individual meetings and more about how society could be fundamentally restructured to make direct democracy possible. Below, we present some ideas to show how society could be organized around the principles of consensus. This is no manifesto. Even for ourselves, there are no definitive answers, and we're certainly not setting out to tell you what the world should look like. However, without thinking about how things could be done, abstract principles like equality and freedom remain exactly that, attractive words with no real meaning. Therefore, we're using this space to try out some more concrete ideas for how decision-making could work in wider society. These serve as a springboard for thinking about some of the challenges we might face in putting our principles into practice and some possible ways these challenges could be tackled. We encourage you to think critically about these things too. Think and talk and listen and argue with us and read and write and agitate for change and try things out on whatever scale you can. Okay, case study, participatory budgeting. Even within the current system, there is some recognition that the more control people have over the decisions that affect them, the better the decisions are made, and the more able people are to accept the outcomes. For example, participatory budgeting was first developed in Porto Alegre, a Brazilian city of 1.3 million inhabitants. This is a year-long process in which the residents of the city make decisions about how to allocate city council spending. First, people get together in neighborhoods to decide what local needs are and to elect delegates to district forums. These forums then create a list of priorities for expenditure and elect 2 members for a citywide municipal budget council, which works out how to distribute the available funds between districts. Systems like this have their limitations. People are given control over a relatively small proportion of decisions that affect them, and it is the citywide council, not the neighborhood meetings, that have the final say. Even given these limitations, in driving, have fun. Sleep well too. Oh, fuck. Oh, God. Okay. Alright, even given these limitations, participatory budgeting goes a lot further than the systems which usually get called democratic, and reportedly has resulted in much more equitable public spending. Is it possible? Question mark. Consensus requires us to behave in very different ways from the competitive norms of capitalist society. Even in small, close-knit groups, people can find it hard to stop trying to win. It is easy to assume that the behavior that we see around you every day represents our human nature, that people act like they do because that is what people will always be like. However, it is hard to judge whether that is true or not if you live in a culture that actively encourages competition. Getting into college, finding work and somewhere to live, persuading someone they want to share their bed or their life with you. In all these significant areas of life, we are encouraged to believe that our success depends on someone else's failure. It seems fair to assume that in a political system which encourages cooperation and responsibility, people might behave quite differently. This is not making any arguments at all about whether human nature is intrinsically good or bad. Quite the opposite is recognizing that most of us are capable of extremes of both selfishness and emotional generosity. We feel it is significant that different human societies uphold different values. For example, the expectations around how much we share personal wealth with people around us will very greatly depend on the culture we live in. If we lived in a society that encouraged and valued shared responsibility, empathy, and cooperation, it seems likely we would be more responsible, more empathetic, and more cooperative, even if we were still capable of competitive behavior. Consensus, with its emphasis on sharing power and finding win-win solutions, has the potential to bring out this capacity for responsibility, empathy, and cooperation. Certainly, we shouldn't limit our imagination to the political and economic systems operating in the world today. It's not a very long time since the dominant view in British culture was that women and working-class people weren't intelligent enough to be educated, or that colonial rule was inevitable and necessary. Oh, I just saw some dude arguing in year 2023 here that women are biologically incapable of wearing pants. We're doomed. We're fucking doomed. Okay. Anyway, it's not just our own culture and behavior that help limit the possibilities for change. And yes, they were a turf. Why do you ask? Oh boy. The powers that shape the world we live in also wield a massive influence. However, events like the so-called Arab Spring demonstrate how much frustration is simmering under the surface. The system we know is not nearly as stable as they would have us believe. Few predicted the widespread impact of the many serious economic crises in the last 100 years. The 1929 Wall Street crash, the 1973 oil crisis, the bank collapse of Iceland in 2008, or the Eurozone crisis starting in 2010, to name just a few. Given the increasing scarcity of the resources on which the global economy is built, like oil for instance, it seems likely more upheaval is to come. Instability opens the door to the possibility of major changes, whether for better or worse remains to be seen. But this makes it all the more important that we start thinking now about what better might look like and what we could do to get there. So how might it work? When consensus was first introduced in Chapter 1, we used the analogy of a group of friends going out for a meal. There was no point in a majority vote to eat pizza if that excluded the celiac and the vegan. Once again, there are tons of pizza places out there that make gluten-free and vegan pizza alongside normal pizza, okay? I know one that I've been to several times. It's very good. Still don't understand this particular choice. They could have chosen anything else. place that only sells burgers, maybe, you know, like that would have made more sense. But then again, you could make a vegan and gluten-free burgers. And there are many places that do. Is the UK like, y'all, what is going on in the UK with your restaurants? Is this like not normal in the UK? Because it's normal in the US. Like where I'm from, or where I live right now, at least. That's like normal. There's tons of restaurants that do that all over the place here. Okay, whatever. Anyway, maybe the UK is very behind on this. It sounds like, because apparently they don't even have pizza without meat on it or whatever. Or pizza with fake vegan cheese on it or whatever. Or cauliflower crust pizza for the gluten sensitive types. You know, you can also get gluten-free flour that you can make more normal pizza dough out of as well. Okay, anyway. Sorry, I'm just annoyed by this. Supposing the question was slightly more important, how should a town prioritize its resources? Should more go on education, healthcare, or transport, for example? See, they're in the UK, so they left out the most important and biggest budget expense that American cities have, which is giving police military-grade weapons and vehicles so that they can beat protesters to death more easily. They forgot that part. They do that in the UK too, though, just to be clear. Just not nearly as much as here. But it's pretty bad there as well. Just saying. So anyway, obviously we have to spend 99% of our budget on giving AK-47s to the cops or whatever. As things stand, the vast majority of the population has very little influence on these issues. Clearly, such questions are more complicated to resolve than where to go out to eat. The decisions involve many more factors, many more people, much greater diversity of opinion, and the consequences are wider-reaching and more significant. We will very probably find it almost impossible to reach the perfect synthesized outcome, where everyone is truly happy with the final decision. On the other hand, because these are wide-reaching decisions with important consequences, and because there aren't any perfect solutions, there is all the more reason for everyone to have the option of involvement. It is much easier to accept a decision if you have been part of making it, feel your opinion has been heard, and understand how that decision came about. This still leaves practical questions, however. We have already said that we couldn't get everyone in the world, or even one country, into one room to thrash out every issue together. Thrash out? What type of thrashing are we talking about? Are we gonna beat the shit out of each other? I bet if you got a room big enough, you could fit the entire population of Vatican City into one room. Just gonna put that out there. They're wrong. Okay. The same is true even in a town, or of a town. So how can that involvement in day-to-day decision-making be achieved? Each community must come to its own conclusions about how to make decisions together. But we have laid out some basic organizational principles that we think would be necessary for any kind of direct democracy to work at a societal level. We then follow with a more detailed model of one possible way of structuring decision-making. Organizational principles, or as the Brits spell it, organizational principles. Decentralization. Decisions should be made by those that are affected by them. Only those with a legitimate interest in a decision should have an input. The more local and decentralized our decision-making is, the more possible it is to get involved in the decisions that affect our lives. I'm gonna read one of those sentences again. Only those with a legitimate interest in a decision should have an input. Diversity is our strength. We all have different needs and desires. To accommodate these, we need to create a fluid society full of diversity, allowing each to find their niche, creating a richly patterned quilt rather than forcing people into the same bland uniform. The more varied the society we create, the more stable it will be. Case study: community self-organization. There should be a hyphen between self and organization. In Argentina, in 2001, a major economic crisis and a popular uprising unseated 4 governments in succession. International media covered food rioting and looting that broke out as a result. However, alongside this were many examples of self-governance and cooperation under extreme pressure. You mean anarchy? Workplaces that have been abandoned by their owners were taken over by workers and turned into cooperatives, from schools to a newspaper to the massive ceramics factories on. Barter clubs cropped up as the currency collapsed. In the absence of government or state services, people met in weekly neighborhood assemblies to discuss pressing issues and organize support for people in the community, for example, setting up soup kitchens or preventing the eviction of squatting workers' co-ops. These assemblies then split into committees that took on jobs like organizing healthcare, and every Sunday, spokespeople from each assembly, spokespersons, not spokespeople, from each assembly met in an inter-neighborhood plenary that reported back on what was going on in the local areas and developed strategies for citywide mobilizations against the government. Is the spelling thing getting all now? I'll stop with the joke because it's annoying. Respect and cooperation between groups. Some decisions have a far-reaching impact. For example, when we use scarce resources or cause pollution, what we do affects people who live far away. Sometimes groups can achieve a lot more collaborating across a wide geographical area. For example, several hospitals sharing a very specialized piece of equipment. Decentralization doesn't have to mean complete atomization if groups collaborate to ensure equality and fairness on a wider scale. Clear and understandable structures. While we need the fabric of our society to be complex, we want the structures for organizing and making decisions to be simple and understandable. It needs to be easy for people to engage in decision-making. Accountability. If you know you are accountable to people around you, it means you have to take responsibility for your actions. This makes it more difficult to accumulate power or play ego games and avoid corruption, common pitfalls of organizing on any scale. Accountability is easier to achieve in a decentralized society, with decisions being made at the local level by the groups of people affected by them. Where we need cooperation on a larger scale, it becomes even more important that decision-making processes are easily understood, transparent, and open. That way, there can be a greater accountability even within much greater groups, or bigger groups. Same thing. Case study: workers' collectives. The remarkable events of the Spanish Revolution in 1936 were the culmination of decades of popular education and agitation. During the Civil War, large parts of the country were organized in decentralized and collective ways. A famous example is the Barcelona General Tramway Company, which was deserted by its managers. The 7,000 workers took over the running of the trams, with different collectives running the trams for different parts of the city. Citywide services were maintained by federalist coordination. The increased efficiency of the collectives led to an operating surplus despite running more trams, cutting fares, increasing wages, and getting new equipment. The general spirit was one of optimism and freedom. A basic model. So, what would this society look like? How could these principles be put into practice? How could services be organized, limited resources shared out, and conflicts resolved? How could healthcare, public transport, and the post work? A common model for structuring society is using neighborhoods and workers' collectives as two basic units for decision-making. Within the neighborhoods, people cooperate to provide themselves with services such as food distribution and waste disposal. Workers' collectives take on projects such as running a bus service, factories, shops, and hospitals. These neighborhoods would involve a fairly small group of people, perhaps all the people who lived on one floor of a very big tower block, a cluster of houses in a rural area, or a group of travelers who went around together. For the sake of this example, we have imagined that the neighborhoods and streets are a smallish town called Utopaville. Oh boy, here we go. Let's take a small. Apparently, I think we're supposed to go through this too, but it's like. Anyway, we'll go through this first. Case study: Federalist coordination. It can be hard to imagine how services such as train travel or bus services through several communities can be organized without a central authority, particularly if each community is independent and organized by its residents rather than a central government. On the other hand, it can be relatively easy to work out how some services between communities can work. The postal service, for example, could work much as it currently does between countries. It's not important how each community decides to organize delivery of letters and parcels, or how much a stamp costs, or whether stamps are even used. The main thing is that there are agreements in place for accepting and passing on post for other areas. Other services such as trains can work in the same way, but obviously need more negotiation. There are timetabling, safety issues, and interregional standards of track and rolling stock to be agreed. But once again, we already have the international agreements in place that show how infrastructure services between socially and economically independent entities are possible. Okay, back to Utopaville. In Utopaville, decisions in all these groups, the neighborhoods and workers' collectives, are made by direct democracy, each member being directly involved in the making of the decisions affecting their lives. Some of these groups might vote, others operate by consensus, but all are characterized by respect for everyone and the desire to find solutions that are agreeable to all. It may sound as if we'd have to spend all our time in committees and meetings, but organizing on a local level is made much easier through daily personal contact, meaning that most things could be worked out through informal and spontaneous discussion and cooperation. Even the street or workplace may not be the smallest working unit. Just as workplaces can have working groups for publicity or purchasing, a street may have a working group for looking after a common resource like laundry facilities or street lamp maintenance. The people within that working group may have an agreed budget to carry out repairs and buy new washing machines, or they may have to take it to the street meeting. Either way, something as low-level as maintaining the laundry facilities should be looked after by people living in small units such as the street, rather than require everyone in a town or city to get involved, although streets may decide to cooperate and share facilities or repairs. For example, something like a disposal of waste, whether that's glass recycling or human feces, will probably need to be agreed between more people. One street could agree to leave raw sewage outside their houses, but this might quickly become a health hazard for other people living near them. Because everyone in the town is potentially affected, there's a strong argument for agreement on minimum standards. Naturally, in this case, everyone will need to have a say in what is decided. This is where some kind of decision-making structure, such as a spokes council, will be useful. In our model town, Utopaville, there are 100 roads or sections of roads, streets, cul-de-sacs, etc., each with approximately 10 dwellings. Each house and flat has an average of 4 people in it. That makes 1,000 dwellings and 4,000 people. Imagine the fun our 4,000 residents would have if they were all in the big hall talking about how to deal with human poo. Even if only half the people had any interest in the issue at all, there'd still be 2,000 people crammed into the room wanting to talk about smell and hygiene and water use and soil fertility and composting. But if each street first considered the issue, then sent 1 or 2 spokespeople to represent their views to a spokes council, we'd have just 100 people trying to speak at our meeting. That's still a lot, but it's 40 times better than 4,000. There may also be other ways we can break down the meeting further. The geography of the town might naturally break down into areas. Let's imagine that there are 4 such areas in our Utopaville: south of the river, on the hill, in the valley, and the north bank. Each area can come to agreement between the 25 spokes and their 25 streets about how to deal with the sewage. Every so often, 1 or 2 people from a spokes council can check in with the other 3 spokes councils that the idea they're coming up with, which are compatible with and acceptable to the other 3 areas. This could be a second-tier spokes council, which regularly meets and is made up with 2 members of each of the first-tier spokes councils. There might even be a need for the people of Utopaville to check that their solutions to the poo problem are acceptable to people in other towns and villages in the area. For example, those sharing an aquifer or water source. This could involve a third-tier spokes council where 1 or 2 residents of Utopaville meet up with people from other towns and villages. In this case, the views of the people in each street in each town would be fed up through different tiers to the regional spokes council. There are some questions in life which have been wider-reaching, or have even wider-reaching impacts than the disposal of excrement. For example, greenhouse gas emissions or the use of very scarce resources. Cooperation may be needed over huge geographical areas, even globally. Further tiers of spokes councils could be used to bring together the views of people living in many different regions. Clearly, the most important part of the spokes council system is that the spokes are only speaking, negotiating, or agreeing with the full knowledge and consent of everyone involved. A group might require that their spoke checks back any decision made, or they might empower them to make decisions on their behalf. Either way, there needs to be mechanisms in place. Needs to be mechanisms? Bit weird pluralization there. Okay. In place, I don't know, that's just well, it's not the pluralization that's the problem. It's needs to be, there needs to be mechanisms. Yeah, that has to be reworded, y'all. In place to make sure that important decisions get made and that delegates remain directly answerable to their group and don't become unofficial leaders. Devices like rotating the spoke at frequent intervals can help avoid power building up. For example, the Camps for Climate Action in Britain from 2006 to 2010 used a system whereby 2 spokes were sent from local groups to spokes council meetings each day. 1 person who had attended the day before to ensure continuity, and 1 person who was new to it. The following day, the person who had been new would go along as the experienced old hand to help out the next new person. In a longer-term system, spokes might not have to change every meeting, but the same basic idea of overlapping rotation of delegates could be followed. This makes it all sound like a lot of work, a lot of toing and froing between local level and the spokes councils, but it's worth bearing in mind that there's likely to be a lot of talking and thinking when we first start to deal with the questions, like how to empty our toilets. But once a system is in place, we'll only need to meet at town level when things aren't working properly. For example, the compost heap is too big, or every so often to double check that everything is working properly. Similarly, to make sure the whole structure doesn't get unwieldy and over-centralized, spokes councils representing a wider area could make very broad brush policy decisions, leaving the details of implementation to more localized areas. For example, if a spokes council agreed on acceptable average level of greenhouse gas emissions per person, decisions could be made in towns about how much of that allocation got taken up by hospitals or public transport, and streets could work out how to divide up the allocation that was left to them. Whether to do things like cooking and laundry together for the sake of efficiency, whether people with certain disabilities should get priority, etc. Or returning to the poo example, on a day-to-day basis, the street may decide that each house is usually responsible for delivering the contents of their compost toilets to the street composting facility. Then each street sets up working groups for things like keeping an eye on the compost heap, turning it when necessary, and carting it out to the area orchards when the poo is safely composted down. Exactly who is on the composting rota and how they are held accountable to their streets is a decision to be made by the streets, not the composting spokes council. have an illustration. We're all going to gather around the toilet to discuss. Oh, I missed one of their case studies, didn't I? This one, case study, community organization. If you visit Christiania in the heart of Copenhagen and get past the touristy parts near the main gate, you'll see people organizing their housing and their workplaces. You might see maintenance teams looking after the infrastructure that make living and working in Christiania possible. Paths being repaired, utility pipes and cables being renewed. The starting point for all social organization in Christiania is simply that every individual has a responsibility for their own life and home. The next level of organizing is the area meeting. The free town is made up of 14 areas which together work out the practicalities of maintaining their area, decide on admitting new residents, and deal with any problems between residents. If a problem can't be solved, it is referred to the community meeting, which meets as often as is needed. The community meeting deals with all questions which affect the whole of the free town, and any Christianite may participate. It feels like we've been live for way longer than 36 minutes, y'all. What time is it? Okay. Challenges, questions, and tensions. We started this chapter with a set of basic principles: freedom, equality, shared responsibility, cooperation, and respect. The model that we offer above attempts to show how these might be put into practice. Pardon me. By using a system of decentralized groups coordinating via spokes councils where necessary, people are able to share control over the decisions that affect their lives. However, if we dig a little deeper, we can see a number of challenges we might face trying to put these principles into practice. We don't believe that these challenges invalidate the model we have offered. However a society makes decisions, there will always be difficult questions to face. Honest discussion about these tensions puts us all in a better place to come up with new ideas or ways of making things work. Can our society be both equal and free? Many people, if asked whether they thought equality and freedom were good things, wouldn't have too much difficulty in saying yes. However, in practice, having both at the same time is not always so straightforward. People use the word freedom to demand the right to do all kinds of things, like carry a gun or drive fast down residential streets. Yet it is pretty clear that a gun or car hold the potential to entirely take away someone else's freedom, to take their life, in fact. These things may represent freedom for the individual wanting to do them. But if everyone has the automatic right to do whatever they want without checking in with anyone else, or doesn't create a free society, it doesn't create a free society, rather. One person's freedom may come at the expense of others. The idea is that having a society based on consensus reconciles this tension, as well as being a way of organizing in groups. Setting up a communal compost toilet system, for in our example, consensus can be a tool for resolving conflict. We can assume that in our society everyone is free to do what they want until that interferes with other people, at which point they use consensus to negotiate a solution. This negotiation happens directly with the other people affected instead of having lawmakers and police intervening. Because we share responsibility for finding a synthesized solution that everyone is truly happy with, or at least a compromise everyone can voluntarily accept, we remain free, but free amongst equals. For example, one person can enjoy the freedom to play loud music in the dead of night and respect their neighbor's equal right to peaceful sleep if they soundproof their walls well. Even on a global scale, negotiations could be set up. For example, between people who wanted to use uranium in the treatment of cancer and the people that lived near the potential mines who were concerned by the evidence that excavation would cause them cancer. True. However, sometimes the other people affected aren't around to let us know that there is a problem and negotiate with us. It is hard to imagine the person who wants to use a gun to defend their house inviting potential burglars over for a reasonable chat about whether they think the use of firearms is justifiable or not. Or suppose a group comes to a consensus decision to dig up the local peat bog in order to fertilize their vegetable patch. The impacts of climate change are so widely recognized that we can imagine other people wanting to get involved in this decision. We can also imagine the people down the road who wanted to burn the peat to heat their homes having a view on the matter. However, the decision also impacts on the wildlife that is currently supported by the peat bog, but a butterfly or a marsh harrier is not able to invite the group to a meeting to reach an agreement. Are you sure? There's a picture of it right here. Can we just get Mothman to represent all of the wildlife? Therefore, a culture that values freedom and equality doesn't just require us to have meetings with our neighbors about the emptying of compost toilets or the communal laundry. The more things we do that have far-reaching impacts, the greater the need to set up negotiations between different groups and individuals. This requires proactive behavior to approach others when what you want to do might affect them, or when they are doing, or what they are doing impacts on you. Living things that are not human adults also need protection. Some people have suggested appointing advocates for things like ecosystems or future generations who can't make it to the meeting in person. The challenge then is how to reach agreement on what living things should be represented and how seriously to take their needs. For example, it is generally accepted that what we eat is a matter of our individual choice, and we shouldn't interfere with what someone else does. However, the pig sitting on our neighbor's plate didn't get the chance to offer its informed consent before being made into bacon. Here we go. And there are certainly people who would like to withhold that consent on its behalf. People who are opposed to abortion would probably make the same argument about a fetus. These examples are deliberately controversial. The pig advocates may not be the same as those supporting the fetus. Other people will not be particularly bothered by either, but will want to defend trees or young children or ancient buildings. The desire to make everyone do the thing you think is right is tempered by the desire not to be made to do the things that other people think are right. Of course, this kind of moral conflict is not unique to a consensus society. In Britain today, there are laws restricting some of the things people might want to do. But there are many areas where if we want something or someone to stop doing something, our only option is to ask them. People with strong views on anything today are faced with the same dilemmas as they would have in a more utopian society. Torn between conflicting pressures of social conditioning, don't cause trouble, it'll be embarrassing, personal morality. On the other hand, other people have the right to their own choices. Or on the one hand, sorry, and then on the other, what you're doing or what they're doing is wrong, and concerns about what kinds of interference will actually be effective. In a culture where direct negotiation is a normal response to disagreement, the conversations might be a little more productive, but still we all have to live with the fact that even in our utopia, other people will keep doing some things we'd rather they didn't, and will possibly want to stop us doing some of the things we think are perfectly reasonable. The only political system that would give an absolute expression of our own belief system would be ourselves as absolute dictator. The alternative we propose is respectful dialogue even when we have profoundly opposing viewpoints. For each individual, this is likely to result in some frustration and imperfect compromises. However, if that respectful dialogue can be achieved, then for a society as a whole, it may be the best response to a muddy reality. What happens when we can't agree? The examples above suggest that in cases of ethical conflict, there will be times when we can't find a synthesized solution everyone is happy with, or even a compromise that everyone can accept. This is likely to be the case also when we have more practical disagreements and incompatibilities, like what hygiene standards should be applied in the communal kitchen, or how to use a limited water supply. Splitting groups as a solution. We named diversity as one of the basic organizing principles of a democratic society. Rather than trying to come to the same agreement about how to live with lots of people, we can divide up into different streets, villages, or towns according to significant things we have in common. This is particularly appropriate if the incompatibilities between us were limited to a particular thing that we share. For example, the people who disagreed about hygiene in the kitchen could be perfectly friendly neighbors provided they didn't cook in the same space. Kitchen hygiene is wild shit, y'all. And by what I mean by that is that some people, it seems like a very large number of people simultaneously clean things more than they need to, but then don't clean other things that they should be cleaning. I'm like, the priorities in the way some people clean their kitchens is a little wild to me. Like, you'll have someone who, like, scrubs the whole sink down twice a day, but doesn't clean the counters. Huh? Or they'll clean the counters, but they just let the utensils get all dirty, and then all the fucking stuff sticks to their utensils and pots and shit, and then it's harder to clean. Anyway. They'll clean the floors but not the cutting board, you know? Like, I don't know what it is. Oh boy. I very commonly have to, if I walk into the kitchen and I want to make something, it's very common that I have to clean a pot or whatever that somebody else used and didn't clean after they used it. It's one pan. God, how hard can it be to just clean it right away? You know, it's easier to clean sooner, right? Or people leave shit in the drying rack that could have just been dried off with a towel and put back where it belongs. Some things I'll leave in the drying rack. Things that aren't going to be immediately needed anytime soon, you know, leave them in the drying rack. You know, a bowl. Well, I have like 50 bowls, so you can put the bowl in the drying rack. Okay. But like, I don't know, like the slotted spoon. We only have one of those. Clean it so that the next person who needs to use it can use it without having to search around frantically for it and realizing that it's like hidden in the drying rack. Put it, just dry it off with the towel. It's very easy. Just put it. Okay, anyway. Oh, wait. All right, let's see here. Right, we're arguing about the kitchen. There could be two workers' collectives that did the same job, but with very different working styles. One very flexible with a lot of last-minute rushes, the other with regular hours and careful scheduling. One town might respond to global limitations on greenhouse gas emissions by developing a low-impact technology, while another group of people choose a lifestyle based on foraging for food and fuel. The option to choose like-minded communities supports social stability. There is much less occasion for conflict if society as a whole creates welcoming spaces for people with a wide range of different views and needs. However, if the issue is not so much an incompatibility in how you do things as some people feeling that something shouldn't happen at all, grammar. Some people feel that something shouldn't happen at all. Division of a group can have limited benefit as a solution. To return to the examples above, if you think that pigs should not be eaten by humans, it probably doesn't make a lot of difference to you where they are eaten, and moving somewhere where you don't have to see it happen may not help. Someone who believes that the human fetus has rights probably believes it about all of them, and not just the ones that are conceived by women living on their street. Or supposing that a large majority of people in a village felt that all land should be owned and controlled collectively. A small group of people who have been farming particular bits of land in their own way for years are very resistant to the idea. When successive meetings have failed to bring any resolution, it is suggested they leave the village and allow the decision to go ahead. This might not greatly placate them. Their attachment is to their land rather than a particular model of land ownership, and no other place could provide that. Additionally, splitting in a group could cause major trauma. We don't necessarily want to choose where we live or work based on questions like people's approach to meetings or washing up. Communities will not always be formed around things we have in common. Some are likely to grow up in the more organic ways that have been common across human history. Who falls in love with whom, where there is water and fertile land, or places to work. Splitting groups because people disagree could mean leaving those people they fell in love with, leaving their friends, leaving the place with the water and the land, or the factory they set up with no guarantee, of somewhere else to go. Different ways of making decisions. Groups that struggle to reach consensus might choose to use a different means of making decisions. For example, imagine trying to reach agreement in a large town. Some people might find it hard to swallow the idea that one person could block a decision that 999,999 people had accepted. Alternatives could range from a simple majority vote. If more than 50% agree, it's okay, to a vote requiring a larger majority, to consensus -1, where a single blocker can be ignored, but the consent of everyone else needs to be secured. Some groups might use these methods all the time. For others, it could be a fallback. For example, if 3 successive meetings have failed to reach consensus, they might switch to a supermajority vote. Using methods other than consensus might enable the groups as a whole to reach decisions and therefore keep functioning as a community. On the other hand, for individuals concerned, the outcomes may be the same as if the group split as a response to unresolved conflict. A dissenting minority that felt so strongly they would have blocked a consensus decision may find that leaving is their best option when they're overruled in a vote. Or if they stay, their commitment to the community and its decision-making processes may be reduced. In looking at what decision-making method to use, a community will need to balance the need to reach an agreement more quickly, or at all, so they can move forward, and the need to maintain the trust and commitment of everyone concerned. The discussions below on enforcing decisions and efficiency feed into the question of how to find this balance. Enforcing decisions. If we make a decision with a group of people, we need to trust that it will be implemented. Suppose we get together with people from a few villages to work out a fair way of sharing the water that comes into the valley. How much should go to schools and health centers, and how much to private homes, for example? What happens if one group starts siphoning off more than their agreed share to fill a swimming pool? Or maybe a childcare collective makes an agreement that no one should hit the children, but some adults start lashing out when they get stressed. The theory of consensus is that when people are involved in making a decision, they are more likely to implement it. They had the opportunity to withdraw their consent when the decision was made, and if they didn't take it at that time, then they will stick to what was agreed. Compared to the political system most of us live in today, this is probably a fair assumption. The people our society names as criminals are often alienated, disenfranchised, and exploited. Those lawbreakers less likely to be identified as criminals, for example, large-scale tax evaders, enjoy the near immunity from punishment that comes with extreme power and wealth. In a society where everyone is empowered as equals, then people are more likely to be able to see each other's common humanity and implement decisions with honesty. However, it is one thing to say that reasons for lawbreaking in our society today include social inequality and a lack of widespread involvement in decision-making. This does not mean we can assume that if those issues could be removed, there would never be any other reasons why people went back on an agreement that had been made. Anyone who has any experience of group organizing is likely to be familiar with agreed to do it but didn't get around to it scenario, or the situation where everyone agrees to something one person wants for the sake of a quiet life, but without any real intention of following through with it. When decisions affect many more people, it becomes harder to truly involve everyone, and the risk that people will not all be brought into the decisions becomes higher. A tiered spokes council allows input from a lot of people, but they may still feel far removed from the group who finally sit together in a room and thrash out an agreement. Imagine a decision was made or through such a spokes council, that coal should be left in the ground. If people in one village knew where a coal seam lay close to the surface, it seems possible that in a cold winter at least some people would go out at night with their spade and liberate some of the coal. So how do we deal with this? If we simply shrug our shoulders and walk away when we see agreements not being kept to, we break the entire system of trust on which our decision-making and our society is based. Who would sit in a meeting trying to reach agreement if they thought that others were going to do what they wanted regardless? Without commitment to keeping to agreements, there is no point in making decisions together, and a system of organized cooperation between equals becomes a system of competitive individualism. The alternative used by most political systems today is to try to prevent infringements of their rules with the threat of punishment. We can be fined or imprisoned, or in some places executed, and if we resist, we can be restrained and intimidated with an array of weapons, from truncheons, dogs, and tear gas to guns, depending on who we are and what we try to do. This system is problematic on a number of levels. Firstly, that using force to punish people doesn't really follow the values of freedom and equality, which we said were the basis of our consensus society. On a more practical level, when we formally empower one group of people to use violence against another, we lay the door open to corruption and oppression. And even if we believe these risks and ethical compromises are acceptable, there is still the question of whether punishment works as well as they claim. Fear of getting caught might stop people from shoplifting, but is it really the fine they are worried about, or the social embarrassment? And is it really the threat of punishment that prevents people from doing more serious things like rape? The figures often quoted in England and Wales, for example, are that only 1 in 10 rapes are reported, and of those only 6% lead to a conviction, suggesting that the risk of punishment is relatively small. In a consensus system, we rely on most people willingly sticking to agreements. Using punishment as a backup might help restrain a few individuals, but could actively undermine the trust and goodwill that led others to comply. Sharing responsibility for creating an accountable culture might be more effective. For example, meetings could regularly check that everyone was doing what they said they would do, and everyone could feel empowered to point out to someone that they weren't sticking to agreements. Knowing that what we do is noticed by our peers may encourage much more responsibility for our actions than punishment by authority, which seems to breed an attitude of, "It's okay so long as I don't get caught." Of course, fear of embarrassment can be a problematic way of controlling people's behavior, the same as more formal punishments are. Offering to reopen a decision when observing someone who isn't keeping to it is more respectful, even if it is not always very realistic. A complementary approach is to do more to build up the trust and goodwill that means people are more likely to voluntarily abide by decisions. After all, if people regularly break agreements, it is likely to be a sign that the conditions of our consensus aren't in place. A lot can be achieved by improving facilitation, thinking critically about who needs to be involved in each decision, tackling unhealthy power dynamics, and addressing conflict constructively so as to increase true involvement in decision-making. However, the likelihood is that all groups will need to have some options available when a decision is not stuck to, or someone is doing something that others find totally unacceptable and refuses to stop. This need might be greater in a group that has, for example, minimized feed and process to spokes council in order to speed up meeting times, or uses other ways of making decisions, like a majority vote. Nevertheless, however high a priority a group gives to inclusion, we can assume that sometimes agreements will be broken. Whatever options a group decides upon, it seems best if decisions on how to ensure accountability are as inclusive and localized as possible. In this way, if a community were to decide they wanted a system of sanctions, then, at least if they used it, whoever was being punished would have been part of setting that system up in the first place. For example, many cooperatives today work together to create a grievance and disciplinary procedure, which usually involves outlining unwanted behaviors, including not abiding by co-op decisions, and setting up a system of warnings which lead up to exclusion. Of course, exclusion in itself is more appropriate in some cases than others. For example, if someone is repeatedly violent and you think they are likely to continue, then exclusion is equivalent to saying, go and beat up someone else. However, the idea of a pre-agreed process and set of consequences could be used with a range of different outcomes. Communities with a less formal approach might use a more case-by-case process of working out with everyone involved how to deal with a situation in a way that enabled everyone's safety. Involvement and efficiency. The section above presents a pragmatic case for everyone being as involved as possible in decision-making. If everyone is equally involved, they will have more of a stake in things, and are more likely to stick to what is agreed. Making the system much more stable. The model of decision-making we describe maximizes inclusion by placing the responsibility for most decision-making at the most local level possible. However, even within this model, there is potential for one individual or group to accumulate power and potentially use it to uphold their own interests against others. The things that we do to limit this accumulation of power can be time-consuming, sometimes debilitatingly so. What can we do to strike the right balance? For example, imagine a street in which only one person knows about the shared finances, one person is always the delegate to spokes councils, and just one person has any skills in electrics. It would be very easy for the finances person to say that an idea they didn't like was too expensive, and no one would be able to contradict them. This might be about them not being totally honest with themselves, rather than about any conscious manipulation, but either way the effects could be the same. The delegate to spokes councils might have even more potential to pick up undue influence on decisions. How often have you come out of a meeting and discovered that everyone had slightly or vastly different ideas about what had been agreed? Consider the possibilities of distorted communication within the group and in reporting to and from the spokes council. Theoretically, the electrician has less power over others. Power. They could make practical decisions like where the wires should go, and the group as a whole could make the decisions about what the end result should be like, for example, whether every building needs connecting up to the solar array. However, this too requires trust and trustworthiness. When the electrician says that a particular plan is impossible, how is everyone to know whether they actually mean a lot of work for me, for example? There are things people in this street could do to make things more equal. Roles could be shared and rotated. Clear records of decisions could be taken so that the spokes mandate is clear. Whoever takes on a particular role could feedback regularly or keep thorough and accessible records. Necessary information can be prepared in advance of meetings so that everyone can meaningfully input. However, this all takes time. Time to skill share when tasks are rotated. Time to work out how to express your specialized knowledge in a way that is detailed enough, but also clear and simple for people who don't have the same expertise in the area. Time to prepare meetings so that everyone can participate in them. Time to record decisions so that you all understand the same thing at the time, as well as being able to check that they are being implemented and tell people who aren't there. The time question can be put into perspective. For example, most people who have been involved in lengthy meetings today are likely to have experienced some frustrations. However, consider one of these frustrating meetings and compare the necessary time spent making decisions to the time spent going off on tangents or quibbling over minor details because no one dared name the real source of a conflict, or floundering about because you don't have enough information to make a decision. In other words, you might find that a lot of the frustration came from trying to do collective decision-making in a culture that often doesn't have the skills, rather than its being intrinsic to meetings. Oh. Oh boy. I'm gonna take a short break. I'll be back in like a couple of minutes. Be right back. I am returned. Let's see here. Okay, I can wrap on this paragraph. Very, very long paragraph. Jesus Christ. What the hell? Alright. Another way to put the time question into perspective is to think about all the time we lose in the current system. Many people spend a large portion of their waking hours going to work to earn money. Some of that time will never be recompensed in wages. It will simply provide profit to their employer. Thank you for the two-sentence explanation of Das Kapital. A massive chunk of the money they do get will be spent on their home, not just on essential repairs, but providing more profit for a mortgage provider or landlord because they have a piece of paper saying they are entitled to collect money in return for you living in a building that is just standing there. Hold on one moment. I have a meme for that. Landlord's right has its origin in robbery. The landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed, and demand a rent for even the natural produce of the earth, says Adam Smith, father of capitalism. He gave birth to that shit. Trans rights. Oh boy. Adam Smith, daddy of capitalism. I'm sorry. Oh boy. Then there is the time we spend earning money that goes on tax. This money is not entirely lost to us. As a society, we get it back every time someone has their recycling taken away or gets treated for cancer. Where do you live? Oh, right, the UK. Or borrows a book from the library. Where do you live? God, we don't have that here. The fuck? The recycling taken away. The city doesn't do that. You have to pay a company to do that. Cancer treatment? No, you gotta pay like 10,000 bucks for that at least. Probably more, actually. Hundreds of thousands. Anyway, let's see here. Oh, what else? Public libraries. Oh yeah, we've been getting rid of those. America. Oh, yeah. However, in the current system, we hand over almost complete control of where that money goes. In this way, some of the hours we put in at work enable the state to afford not just hospitals and schools, but also nuclear weapons and the financial clout to come off on top in international negotiations. This compulsory appropriation of our time through various channels is so normalized that most of the time we're not even aware of it. But in a society in which we made our decisions as free and equal people, it seems unlikely that anyone would voluntarily give away hours of their time for someone else's profit, like we do when we work for a private company or pay to live elsewhere. Pay to live somewhere. We would be much more likely to give the equivalent of tax, offering material things like time, money, or other units of exchange to communal services. However, when we are part of making decisions about how such services are run, then it is likely to feel less like such things are simply taken away from us. Therefore, unless we are very bad at our meetings, the time that it takes to make decision-making inclusive could be compensated by getting back the time which is invisibly given away in the current system. However, even in the most efficient group in the world, there will still be a tension between the desire for everyone affected to get fully involved and the need or desire to spend time doing other things. Every group can work out which areas are particularly important to prioritize involvement in and which it is more acceptable to allow shortcuts to be taken for. Looking at the examples above, the group might be totally happy to trust the expertise of the electrician without asking questions, but they might want the finances to be done by one person for a maximum of 5 years, with thorough records accessible to all, and their spokespeople to rotate every 6 months with thorough consultation on each decision. What about the people who don't want to be involved? There are always likely to be people who don't want to come to meetings. This could be for a variety of reasons, not just lack of engagement, but for example, meeting burnout, general stress or illness, even a trust that other members of the collective will reach the right decision. Such people obviously shouldn't be forced to take part, but similarly, they may have to live with the consequences of any decision they decided not to participate in. When faced with non-participating members, collectives should at least make the effort to make sure that everyone who may be affected is aware of the decisions that are being taken. The reasons for non-participation should be worked out, and ways of encouraging and enabling participation should be considered. So what do we do with all these unanswered questions? The ideas that we offer clearly do not provide a simple home over the rainbow where all the humanity's problems will be sorted out. Some of the suggestions we have made involve uniting different ideals. For example, it is possible for decision-making to become more inclusive and quicker with the use of good facilitation in your meetings. It is possible for someone to experience freedom without exerting power over someone else if both people can be involved in looking for a decision that truly works for everyone. But sometimes all we can do is look for the best balance between different imperfect options. In the examples above, however good your facilitation, it will still take more time getting everyone fully involved in a discussion than using shortcuts like considering one preformed proposal. So a community will have to make case-by-case decisions about whether to prioritize speed or inclusion in a given circumstance. If you can't find a solution which genuinely works for everyone involved, then some people will feel they are losing some personal freedom to the group. A community whose guiding principles are freedom and equality will have to find its own answers to these problems by trying things out and reflecting on how that is working. Then trying more things out until they reach a system that they can live with. If you find the lack of perfect answers discouraging, it is important to remember that the current system doesn't come anywhere near to getting any of these things right. If your life is relatively free and comfortable, then globally speaking, you are enjoying a rare privilege. This doesn't mean you don't have the right to be free and comfortable, but that your comfort is not an indication that everyone else is okay too. For example, a financially well-to-do person living in Britain may be intellectually aware of the injustice and exploitation involved in things like sweatshop labor, corporate land grabbing, and the extinction of other species, but not feel the same daily emotional pressure they would if they were living these things firsthand. We don't say this to trigger your guilt responses. None of us chose the world we were born into, but we can choose to see it for what it is and work for something better. How do we get there? So, as an individual, or a group, or even a social justice movement, what can we do now that brings us any closer to realizing the potential for another fairer world? Thinking about these questions as an individual or a group, it is clear that anything you choose to do will only be a small part of the overall picture. You cannot wake up one morning and say, "I'm going to transform society today." However, this does not necessarily mean that you might as well stay in bed waiting for someone else to do it. There are a number of different ideas about what are the best things to do in the present to support the possibility of real change that gets to the root of the problem. Without a crystal ball, it is hard to know which will have the best outcomes. We have presented a few of the ideas that are already out there. This is neither a comprehensive list nor a coherent strategy. The aim is to spark your thinking processes about what fits your priorities, skill, and situation. The scale of change we are talking about cannot be achieved by booting out individual politicians or business leaders, but only by removing the structures which give them power. This kind of total shakeup of society is often described as the revolution. However, getting rid of today's power structures is only part of the story. An uprising may be spontaneous, but an organized society like the one we describe is unlikely to organically emerge from the ruins of state capitalism. Oh, they're Leninists. I'm kidding. When we don't have corporations and governments and armies, what happens next? If a successful revolution is followed by chaos, then people are very vulnerable to a new dictator waiting in to rescue them, and we could be left with a regime that is more authoritarian than the one we had before. Whatever we put in place is unlikely to survive, unless it can set up ways of organizing that meet people's basic needs, both immediately and in the long term. Therefore, whatever we do needs to keep in mind these two goals: getting rid of the old system and being able to build something better in its place. Traditional models of how change might happen. There are a number of models for how the current system might end and a new one be put in its place. Broadly speaking, they fall into either a Marxist-Leninist or an anarchist/libertarian category. Note, these categories are very loose, and the systems we are talking about go under many names. The point we are trying to make is that there are a variety of ideas out there. They're gonna try and do a basic explanation of Marxism, Leninism. Alright, y'all, let's critique this. Here we go. So I'm just saying. One paragraph explanation. Here we go. The basic theory is that capitalism will create a society so divided and unequal that exploited workers will start a revolution. There will then be a transition period, referred to as socialism, in which a worker-controlled dictatorship will oversee the development of a new, more egalitarian society. Once a culture has developed that takes cooperation and equality as the norm, then the dictatorship of the proletariat will be able to wither away, leaving a communist society to manage itself based on these principles. History provides plenty of examples of societies that have entered the first stages of a revolution followed by a dictatorship. They keep calling it that, but the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's disingenuous to just refer to it as a dictatorship, because most people's idea of a dictatorship thinks of like one guy in charge. That's not what it means. Dictatorship of the proletariat just means that the proletariat is in charge of making most of the decisions. That's what it means. Okay. Examples: the Soviet Union, China, etc. However, what these examples suggest is that power, once gained, is very hard to give up, even when you try. This is actually true. It has been tried. Mao tried it with the Cultural Revolution, a little bit, kind of. It's more complicated than that. Some people would try to argue that the Cultural Revolution was Mao's attempt to consolidate his own power, which I find to be a hilarious misinterpretation. That is so absurd, but okay. What an absolute joke. Okay, tell me you've never read anything about the Cultural Revolution ever. Okay. But anyway, Mao did attempt to decentralize and debureaucratize the party, but the problem is that that's really hard to do, like they say, once those things are in place. He didn't like those things. He used to be an anarchist. You probably already know that. He was constantly complaining about all sorts of things that had to do with centralization and bureaucracy, but never could really escape them, because he already, was part of an organization that did those things, so it was a bit too late. And the Cultural Revolution was also way too late. Anyway, that's just my opinion. However, what these examples suggest is that power once gained is very hard to give up, and new systems may end up exerting at least as much control over people's lives than what they replaced. Oh boy. On the other hand, genuine attempts to devolve power in Marxist-Leninist-inspired political systems have led at best to a shift to whatever the current international default system of control is. For example, Hungarian Republic reforms in 1988-89 leading to the introduction of Western-style liberal capitalism, or otherwise to brutal repression, such as the Prague Spring of the Czechoslovakian Socialist Republic. In 1968, the Communist Party started a process of democratization, decentralization, and greater freedom for the population, such as ending both censorship of the press and surveillance by secret police. This was quickly suppressed by an invasion by allied Marxist-Leninist states. That's one way to frame it. Interesting ways to frame the Marxist-Leninists would disagree with your framing, but you know. Boy. Anarchist/libertarian. In terms of making decisions by consensus and of cooperating with other people and groups, we feel there are many useful ideals in the history and philosophies of anarchism. Ideas, not ideals. Although there are many respected thinkers in the history of anarchy, none have, or presumably ever wanted, the ideological status accorded to Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Mao, etc. Consequently, there are much more than a handful of ideas of how we get from here to our utopian society. We've taken the liberty, again, of oversimplifying into two main categories: revolution/crisis, and building a new society in the shell of the existing one. The basic idea of a revolution is that people who have been downtrodden and exploited by the current system come together to overthrow it. This could be the spontaneous response to a major crisis, or the result of years of political organizing. Another strand of thought involves evolution, or building our new society in the shell of the old. This relies on creating and developing parallel systems. These are alternatives that exist alongside and within a capitalist economy, but provide more egalitarian ways of meeting our needs, for example through community groups, grassroots cooperatives, and alternative economies. Some people hold a strong preference for one or other of these strategies. Some believe parallel structures could keep expanding until they replace current systems, so that a new system evolves without any need for dramatic upheaval. Hi, Richard Wolff. It's not really Wolf, it's Wolf. Richard Wolff. That guy. Others place all their emphasis on revolution and critique parallel structures because these currently only provide alternatives for a small subset of society, and often make compromises to survive in a capitalist system. However, for many people, revolution and the building of parallel structures are complementary strategies. As we have said, while insurrection or internal collapse may be needed to get rid of the existing system, and this may even happen spontaneously, like a popular uprising following a sudden economic crisis, the more building blocks that have already been laid, the more easily created a new system can be. Parallel institutions like co-ops, as well as more explicitly political groups set up to confront power, can provide these building blocks. They develop the ideas, skills, and connections necessary for self-organizing and large-scale cooperation. Whether or not you have a preference for either of these strategies or some totally different ideas, we have assumed that most readers of this book will be working towards a society that is brought about voluntarily by people who will live in it, rather than the Marxist idea of an equal society being initially imposed by a dictatorship, and freedom coming later if and when society as a whole is ready to live voluntarily as equals. Tactics for the present. We don't attempt to sketch a complete map from here to a political utopia. The context in which major changes happen will undoubtedly throw up challenges which we do not specifically address here, like how to survive ecological collapse or violent suppression by a would-be dictator. When faced with a tank or a tidal wave, consensus probably won't be the first tool in the box. Both of those problems can be solved by pointing rocket launchers at the... I'm kidding. You can only deal with the first problem with that. The second one, you need to point a coastal mangrove at it. Good luck with that. Not going to grow fast enough. What can we offer what we can offer are thoughts on what might be a first few steps in the direction of the society we'd like to see, starting from the present. So, assuming the overall idea is to bring about a new society through some kind of combination of revolution and building a new society in the shell of the old, what tactics can we use now to bring us any closer to our goals? Creating a new society can be done gradually and piecemeal. A revolution is something that happens over a short period in the right historical moment. This doesn't mean we should sit back and wait for it. There are things we can do that might help us to create and seize the historical moment if it arrives. Many of these things can also help us to build a new society. For example, what we do to foment rebellion can also involve modeling and developing more democratic ways of organizing. Therefore, we have divided possible tactics up into 3 broad overlapping categories. Which all work to a certain extent within both strategies. Confronting power, building alternatives, and cultural change. We offer a few thoughts about how each might be done well to give us the best chances in an uncertain future. Case study: redistribution of resources. After a demonstration in Budapest was gunned down by secret police in 1956, a general strike broke out through much of Hungary. The government collapsed, and over 2,000 workers' and peasants' councils were set up in workplaces, villages, and towns. The new Hungarian national government was declared by moderates, but was largely sidelined or ignored as land was redistributed to those who could work it, and food was taken to the towns to feed the urban population. The revolution was crushed by Soviet tanks after just over 2 weeks. This is what tankies are about, by the way. This is where the term originally came from. It came from a bunch of British people specifically arguing over whether or not it was right to do this, or whether or not Khrushchev was right to bring the tanks into Hungary. Anyway, just after over 2 weeks, but the Hungarian Revolution is remarkable for the speed in which resources such as land and the means of production were locally redistributed to those involved in maintaining and using them. Yeah, and then when they eventually became not Soviet anymore, now they've slowly turned into fascism. So, okay, not so slowly, pretty quickly actually. Very standard thing for countries to do post-Soviet era is go like full fash. Yeah. Confronting power. On one level, those with power over us have it because they have the wealth or force to punish and reward us. We do what they say either because they pay us to do it, or because they have police and armies to make us do it. However, another way of looking at the relationship is that those with power have it because we give it to them, for as long as we do what they want us to do. As soon as we stop complying or actually prevent them from doing what they want, they lose that power. From challenging a sexist comment to organizing a strike to smashing up a fighter plane, confronting injustice can have a small destabilizing impact on the system. This is not to claim that any slight act of resistance is a direct stepping stone to revolution, nor is it to glamorize all rebellion for its own sake. There are things we can do which have a much greater impact than others, and there are things which have disproportionate consequences for ourselves. Unless we want a movement of heroic martyrs, the question is how to use confrontation strategically to have the maximum destabilizing effect whilst retaining our own strength and resilience. A crucial question is the support we give each other. In what form that is needed depends on what you plan to do. The labor strike is the classic example of activism that is much more effective with the engagement of everyone affected, the workforce and anyone who might be tempted into working in their place. A handful of people could smash up a fighter plane, but these individuals will rely on others to sustain them through court cases or whatever else the aftermath might involve. Even something as simple as challenging a sexist comment can be a much more empowering experience when you know that other people will back you up. This doesn't mean that a small number of people can't achieve anything, rather that it helps to think carefully about the extent you will rely on the support of others and work out how you can ask for that or do things where you are less reliant on numbers. Another question is where to target confrontational activism. Some people like protests at world summits or one-off actions against hubs of gross concentrated power like banks or power stations because this allows them to pit themselves against capitalism, climate change, or the system in general. Actions like these provide a springboard for opening up debate or raising awareness about how the world is run and the alternatives that are possible. For others, a coherent campaign against a more specific target holds a greater chance of immediate impact. The scale of change may be small, addressing the exploitative work practices of one minor company or stopping a new supermarket opening in a small town, for example. However, creating measurable change of any kind can be more empowering and inspiring for some than the kind of diffuse impact we have when we take on bigger targets. Oh, look. Please tell me we're going to finish this book on this stream. We're close to the end, I think. I know there's some appendices at the end, so... building alternatives. By building more aware, cooperative, and consensus-based pockets of society now, we can prepare for an uncertain future. In part, that is about building structures that can start to take over some of the functions of today's economy and political system and demonstrate that there are other ways of working. It can also be about having some organizations in place that can be scaled up or replicated if capitalist and state institutions implode or get torn down. For example, if the national currency collapses, we could use alternative economies such as time banks, local exchange, trading systems, and barter networks. The transition may be easier if these systems exist and are used already. There will be some people with the skills and ideas, and some infrastructure in place that could be used. For example, a time bank that was administered through a website could easily expand to encompass a lot more people and their skills. In other situations, replication of existing organizations might be a better plan. A village food co-op selling vegetables from local farms might suddenly be inundated if the supermarket supply chain failed. Possible options could be to take over more space and buy up a bigger proportion of the local produce. However, the supply of food could possibly be spread out more effectively if one member of staff devoted their time to visiting other villages and helping them set up their own food co-ops. In many cases, expansion or replication won't be an either-or choice. Existing units will be able to expand a little before splitting up to prevent decision-making and accountability becoming unwieldy, and to allow people to do things in the ways that suit them. Either way, the better the systems and organization develops now, the better placed they will be to welcome new people to pass on their model to others at a point where it is needed. Case study: alternative currencies. In Central Europe in the 1920s and 30s, local currencies ensured employment and affordable food and accommodation, despite hyperinflation in national currencies. For example, the local council in Vergel in Austria issued 32,000 shillings in Freigeld in 1932. Freigeld is a local convertible currency which loses value over time. In the case of Vergel, the money lost 1% of its value every month, which ensured that it was spent quickly. Circulation was estimated at 400 times over 14 months. This allowed the council to spend on civic regeneration, creating jobs, and taking the local area out of recession. Unemployment, rising dramatically in the rest of the country, fell from 21 to 15% over 14 months. By 1933, other councils began to express an interest in issuing their own Freigeld, and the state threatened to send in the army if the Vergel Council did not withdraw its local currency. Alright, culture change. We first introduced these categories as overlapping. Broadly speaking, what we do to confront power and create alternatives is worth it for the immediate effects it has. Or rescuing one fox from the hunt, changing a discriminatory education admissions policy, or creating a way for some people to use other people's unwanted stuff. However, these activities can also be a means of creating the possibilities of a culture that is more cooperative, more empowered, and more equal. This doesn't mean setting out to manipulate people into changing their culture. It means creating space for different kinds of behavior and interaction to grow and letting people decide for themselves what works for them. Where we're at now. What kind of culture change needs to happen will depend on the culture from which you are reading this. As Seeds for Change, we write in capitalist Northwestern Europe, and this is the only context we feel qualified to talk about. We observe a number of developments in that culture, elements of that culture that prop up the current system and make the creation of a new one more challenging. One of the most obvious examples is the way we are encouraged to compete and conform for survival within the system. While each individual is trying to make sure they are the one to get a council house or a university place or job, then we are not getting together to address the underlying problem of there not being enough to go around, and the overall effect is to increase inequality. While we buy into the idea that we need to be the same as other people to be accepted, we aren't making space. We aren't making space for the real acceptance we experience when people take us as we actually are. This mentality can leak into our decision-making, the desire to conform and making us less open and trusting, the habit of competition reinforcing hierarchies and making us less able to work together as empowered equals. Along with competitiveness and conformity goes atomization. In countries like Britain today, many people don't even know their neighbors. Their social lives usually involved a closed circle of friends and some people they work or study with. Outside these closed circles, they spend their day weaving in and out of strangers, perhaps a quick nod to a familiar face, a few ritual conversations at the bus stop, and an exchange of minor favors like feeding next door's cat. This clearly poses a challenge for a decision-making model which relies upon a unit like the street being the place where the fundamentals of daily life get worked out, and upon humans being able to cooperate across wide geographical areas. As well as the attitudes, our society often lacks the skills that go along with a more communal way of life. Hierarchical systems prepare us to do what we're told, or to tell others what to do, but not to share responsibility. Even something as simple as organizing a holiday between a group of friends can flounder because people are not in the habit of facilitating group conversations about things like what everyone can afford or even where to go. This can make meetings about minor uncontroversial topics a frustrating experience. Never mind negotiating through conflict under pressure. If society dramatically changed, we can expect that people would pick up new skills, possibly very quickly. However, developing confidence through long-term positive experience can help us keep problem solving when things don't work the first time. Finally, there is the question of political analysis and vision. Dissatisfaction with politicians and cynicism about advertising is widespread. However, there often seems to be a lack of follow-through. People continue to vote for the same parties and buy the same products in spite of an uneasy awareness that neither will quite do what it says on the tin. It is not clear to what extent this is about not being convinced by or aware of alternatives, or to what extent it's about a reasonable desire to get on with the life that is familiar, rather than invest time and energy in the uncertainty of change. Either way, if we are looking for a free and equal society, then people can't be forced, persuaded, or deceived into going along with it. Hello, ATS. They might rally around an attractive idea in a moment of crisis, but if this is the first time they have thought about politics, then leaders can offer more enticing quick fixes. Vote for me and I'll make things fair. It is understandable that many people crave safety and stability, and even a dictator who offers this at a time of unrest, along with special benefits for their supporters, is likely to get some kind of a following. If a society is to be co-owned from the bottom up, then the people who will live in it need to be actively involved in creating visions for how it might look, and have a realistic idea about what that entails, not to mention a healthy cynicism about the promises of anyone who offers easier options. Case study: culture change. After the German armed forces in Berlin surrendered to the Red Army in May 1945, there was a period of several weeks before arrangements were made to provide for the civilian population and to start rebuilding the city. Nevertheless, the day after the surrender, workers at a cable factory in southeast Berlin picked their way through the ruined city to what was left of their workplace. The bosses and the Nazi commissars had fled or were in hiding, but the workers started to salvage what they could of the machinery, soon managing to begin production again. Other workers from the plant went out into the surrounding countryside to find food and fuel to share it back at the factory. This was by no means unique in Berlin or the rest of Europe at the time, but the desire of these and other workers to begin organizing their workplace themselves and to take care of each other is notable when placed in the context of the period. In 1945, they had endured or even participated in 12 years of Nazi rule, a time of suspicion, fear, and ceaseless propaganda, demonizing the weak in society and condemning cooperation and solidarity. We find this example inspiring because it shows how humans have the capacity to look after and consider each other's needs despite being subject to extremely negative and pervasive socialization. What can be done? So what do we do about this mismatch? To a certain extent, we can place some hope in examples of how people have pulled together and started self-organizing when there has been a sudden vacuum of power. Culture can change very rapidly when the situation in which we live also changes. See the box on the previous page. However, we can increase our chances of success if we do what we want, presumably, or do what we can, rather, to build the equal, honest relationships, the skills and political awareness that a healthier society can grow from. The suggestions we make here just scratch the surface of the possibilities out there. Likewise, they only scratch the surface of the changes that would need to be made. However, we need to start somewhere, so here are a few ideas of how things might be done. Share ideas. We have said that a new society relies upon real involvement from a wide range of people. To create a society that is truly free and equal, this needs to be the voluntary involvement of people who go in with their eyes open, not recruits and converts who've been drafted in by the hard sell. Of course, we may want to counter the powerful propaganda machine of state capitalism. We don't need to hold back from giving people access to alternative possibilities and ways of looking at the world. But if we rely on rosy promises or set out to persuade people, then we assume they cannot make intelligent choices about what to believe, an assumption that runs counter to the very society we are trying to create. Being open about politics without ramming it down people's throats is a delicate art as well as an important one. Starting where people are currently at is a pretty important principle. For example, leaving straight in with a fully developed model for utopia when someone comments on the unreliability of their MP may be a bit too much. For thoughts on how to share ideas, go back to Chapter 8, page 170. Creating settings in which people can experience different ways of organizing can fulfill a similar function of passing on new ideas, but leave people space to think for themselves about how well they work. Even if we just organize events or particular projects that give only short or marginal opportunities of our involvement, whether that's a protest camp or a community group meeting once a month, the exposure we can provide to respectful communication and decision-making can give people a sense of what is possible, an awareness that our society can be organized differently. We have seen many times that even just a single experience of a well-facilitated consensus meeting has inspired people to think critically about the status quo and how things can be changed. However, that critical thought also needs somewhere to go. Longer-term projects that are embedded in a community and provide a viable way for people to meet their needs have a greater influence on how people see the world, as well as having a more real material impact. Model alternative ways of working and make them accessible. Having a wide range of different types of parallel systems will help more people access cooperative organizing skills. For example, something like a free cycle network, a mental health service users self-help group, or an allotment association may include people who don't see themselves as political in any way. For others, anger is a great immobilizing force. They will start engaging in campaign groups when they are threatened by something external, like a new road being built through their village or welfare benefits being taken away. These alternatives don't even have to be groups as such. You can build connections within your community more informally by organizing a street party or knocking on doors in your tower block and trying to come up with a collective response when the landlord repeatedly fails to fix the stair lights. If this is too much, then even inviting the neighbors around for a cup of tea could be a start. Accessibility is about more than what you are doing. See Chapter 8 for some steps your group can take to avoid replicating the exclusion and oppression that characterizes mainstream society. Alright, develop skills. As usual, it is worth thinking about how we do these things. If we have meetings when we are stressed, anxious, and bossy, the cooperative skills we gain and pass on may be minimal. If our activism is ineffective and badly thought through, then what we do may be less than inspirational. Remember, we don't necessarily achieve more by frantically doing more. Looking after ourselves and each other and taking the care and time to do things well is likely to be more effective in the long run. The section challenges questions and tensions above outlined some of the difficulties we might face trying to organize society along libertarian and egalitarian lines. We didn't offer perfect one-size-fits-all solutions, but suggested that groups could find their own practical techniques to make things work. This work doesn't need to wait till a new society forms. We grapple with these kinds of questions whenever we try to work non-hierarchically. For example, a network of groups running a campaign will face some of these questions, like how to respond when some of the local groups don't stick to decisions that were made collectively. Smaller, more close-knit collectives, like a workers' co-op or an affinity group, which regularly does actions together, may only include a few people at a time. However, the experience of working together over a long period can create the commitment and will develop some of the more involved skills that this book covers, like tackling power dynamics or collaborating to find a way out of the conflict. Share skills. Developing skills only becomes useful to society as a whole when we are able to pass them on. In activism, it is quite common for cliques to form of people who share political ideology, culture, and lifestyle. They can develop their own jargon and sometimes a whole language of hand signals. This easy, comfortable communication may help with their specific aims, like setting up a housing co-op or doing direct action together. However, if they remain socially isolated and don't take the time to build up trust, openness, and good communication with a wider community, it is unlikely that they will be able to effectively share their cooperative organizing skills in a moment of crisis. Instead, their confidence and experience may put them into the role of unofficial leaders or mean that they are resented and not listened to at all. Similarly, if they have spent their politically active life only associating with people who use the same language to express the same opinions, they may be less able to listen to and respect the same or the very different views and needs of their neighbors. Sharing skills, therefore, is not just about running workshops. This can be a great idea for people who already want to know more about something. However, it is also important to think about how to make your skills accessible to a wider range of people. As always, there is a tricky balance to be struck so that you offer your skills in a way that enables and empowers other people, rather than taking over the role so that no one feels able to step into it. Creating a more equal society in the here and now. The more we do now, or can do now, to unpick the inequalities between us, the better placed we will be to make decisions as empowered equals in a consensus-based society. Chapter 8 looks at approaches you can take to sorting out power dynamics in consensus groups. Outside these groups, there are in most cases, wider inequalities to be tackled. On a day-to-day level, the status quo can be eroded when individuals take opportunities to challenge the behavior and assumptions of people in their wider community. For a more concentrated impact, it can help to get together with other people affected by the same form of oppression, and form groups dedicated to tackling it as well as to empowering yourselves. If these groups connect and coordinate with each other and potentially draw on support from outside people and groups, then a broader movement can be formed that works against all oppression, not just that which is targeted at particular identities. A final thought. When you look at the scale of change that is needed, then anything you choose to do can feel like chipping away at a mountain face with a toothpick or emptying an ocean with a thimble. As well as scale, there is a question of compromise, something that is lost in translation between your elegant visions of the future and the day-to-day reality of getting on with your colleagues or writing leaflets for your campaign. However, try turning this on its head. If we really believe in freedom and equality and shared power, then how could anyone think that a better world for 9 billion people could be delivered by one person single-handedly? Unless we intend to set up a dictatorship that stamps our vision across the entire globe, then we will have to accept that the impacts of what we do will be diffuse, localized, or both. In other words, if we aren't trying to set up a society that gives a huge amount of power to any individual, then it follows that the process of getting there will also involve thousands upon millions of people and groups all doing their thing and coordinating as best they can. If you happen to live through a period of intense revolutionary activity, you will have been enabled to do this by all the generations that went before you. And if you never see a significant change in your lifetime, your stepkids, children's, neighbors, nieces, who do will still owe a small part of their achievements to your efforts today. And in the meantime, the small material difference we make when we set up a co-op or organize an empowering community meeting or save a small belt of woodland is worth it, because real life is in the here and now. Afterward, okay. Yeah, some final thoughts, but then it's not done. Afterward. The way we make decisions is an important part of how we put our political and ethical beliefs into practice. Consensus is based on principles of freedom and equality. It aims to find a balance between the needs of the individual to have control over what they sign up to, and the needs of the group to work together in order to get things done. It rejects the idea that for one person to win, someone else has to lose. Instead, we think creatively to find solutions that the whole group can be happy with. Even when there is no such perfect solution to be found, the process reaffirms our commitment to each other, making it more possible to willingly accept compromise for the sake of the group. However, reaching decisions that have the true, meaningful consent of everyone involved can be tricky at the best of times. And usually, there are some extra complications to deal with. Being a very large group, we're all living in different parts of the world, or having simmering conflicts that have never been addressed. Dealing with these situations well can take dedication, positivity, and patience, and when our own energy is not matched by other people's, we can easily get frustrated. At the same time, when consensus achieves what it sets out to do in a difficult situation, it puts our other experiences of decision-making into a new perspective. We realize that it isn't necessary to give up our own freedom in order to work with others. We do not need to hand over our power to a few remote politicians or union leaders or employers. We do not need to try to win. We can be trusting and open and expect honesty and consideration in return. When we struggle with shared responsibility, then in large part this may be because we aren't used to it, not because it is intrinsically more difficult than other ways of making decisions. It requires us to learn some skills and knowledge we haven't grown up with, but with practice and will we can learn. For example, we work out how a large group meeting could be structured to allow everyone to be included, how to make any meeting more effective and enjoyable, and how to deal with power imbalances or a conflict head-on without losing respect for the other people involved in those unhealthy dynamics. Learning these things is about more than making our own particular group work better. It is about developing the skills as a society that could open the door to new ways of working together, based on collective control and direct democracy. We believe that the skills, attitudes, and conditions that underpin consensus decision-making are what we need, whether in a small group or in the whole world, to live together on a basis of freedom, equality, and shared power. Okay, that's the end of the book proper. There's also an appendix that provides a short guide to facilitating workshops. It's not particularly long, so I guess we can read that too. Okay, good. You've been, sorry. So, hold on. So, oh, come on. So, oh God. Come on, throat. Oh boy. So you've been asked to run a workshop or skill share. Sharing knowledge and skills is an important part of contributing to our communities, and doing this means the wheel doesn't have to be continually reinvented. Perhaps more importantly, when we pass on skills to others, it is less likely that informal hierarchies will build up in our groups. In this guide, we will go through the basic steps that can help your workshop really work for you and your group. Preparation. Preparation is the key to a good workshop, and it also helps you to be more confident. An agenda or workshop plan is a good way to make sure you're adequately prepared, and that you are being sensible about what you can cover in the time you have. It's always tempting to try to cram in too much, so be realistic about how much time you give to activities, and be brutal about taking stuff out. First of all, work out your aims for the workshop. You may find it helps to write them out at the top of the agenda when you're working on it. Come back to these as you plan each activity. Does what you're planning to do help you achieve your workshop aims, or help the group relax and get to know each other? If not, you probably don't need the activity. How to design your workshop. We're used to workshops that end up being presentations or group discussions. They're easier to organize, but with just a little bit of work, we can help participants learn much more from our workshops and enjoy them more too. People remember better if they are actively involved in their own learning, and if the workshop is interesting and dynamic. Teacher or lecturer. Teacher is an expert. Learning from few to many, learners have less control of their learning. Versus a facilitator. Only expertise needed is facilitation. Knowledge drawn from the group and shared, and learners can set the agenda and share skills and knowledge. Okay. Facilitating a workshop is about helping your group to share their own experiences. You can also add your own experiences and knowledge, but the key is that everyone is really involved. Ask yourself whether someone in the group might already know or have some experience in your topic. If you think they might have, work out a way to get them to contribute. You could use an idea storm or split your participants up into smaller groups and give them a task. Even if the knowledge comes mostly from you, you can plan games, role plays, or practice sessions and chances for participants to reflect on their experiences to make your workshop more participatory. The agenda mix. We all learn in different ways, so the best thing to do is to include different kinds of exercises and tools in your workshop. If you can get your participants listening, thinking, moving around, and contributing at different points during your workshop, the chances are that everyone will enjoy it. It's a good idea to make sure that people move around every 90 minutes or so. A quick energizer, physical activity, or just changing seats can help stop people nodding off. Go back to chapter 6 to get some ideas on how to vary your workshop. Okay. Practical exercises. If your workshop is about practical things like how to do a release, or wire up a solar panel, then make sure to add enough time for people to try out their new skills. This helps build people's confidence and means they're more likely to remember what they've learned, especially if they get the chance to try things out several times and not just the once. Breaks. When designing a workshop, it's easy to forget the breaks. There always seems to be more to fit in than time will allow. But we're all human, both facilitators and participants, and when we're tired and don't function when we're tired, we don't function too well. Mood. And that includes understanding and remembering what the workshop was about. If your workshop is 2 hours or less, it's usually enough to make sure there is a possibility to get tea or coffee or a trip to the pub at the end. But if your workshop is longer than 2 hours, then it's a good idea to schedule a break every 90 minutes or so with an energizer in between. Preparation checklist. Have you included a good balance of different types of activities? Have you made time for practical sessions, breaks, and energizers? Have you thought through what you're going to say and how you're going to do things? Are all the practicalities like publicity, venue, seating, refreshments, etc. sorted? Do you have all the materials you need? Have you checked whether anyone has particular needs and how you can cater for those? And alright, finally, want to find out more? This short guide introduces some of the things you can do to make your workshop enjoyable and productive. If you want to find out more about facilitating workshops and the tools you can use, have a look at the longer briefings on our website, which is once again pinned to the top of the chat. And then there's the glossary, blah 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 blah, and the index, blah blah blah, and further reading. I'm just gonna scroll over the further reading, okay, slowly here. You can pause and look if you're watching the VOD, or you can just grab the PDF yourself and look at it. Okay. It looks like this is made to be printable as well. It has a back page and an ISBN. Has a back cover page. All right. Well, very good timing. Just past our 2-hour mark today. We are done with the book. Yay. Okay. So I'm going to make sure I save all of the reading portions of the streams as highlights on Twitch, and then I'm going to also download all those and edit them all together into one long video that I will upload to YouTube that will just be the whole book all the way through. Yeah. So if you're watching on YouTube in the future, thanks.